Halsey continued his planning for strikes on Luzon and Lingayen Gulf, using Admiral Sherman's force for the purpose. But the aerial search reports continued negative, while the submarine reports became ever more exciting that afternoon and evening, with talk of the Dace's sinking of her heavy ship, the Bream's exploit off Manila, and then the Data's message about the Kurita force. The night carrier Independence was ordered to launch night search planes, but tomorrow would tell the tale. On October 23, while the Americans were searching out the Japanese fleet and finding 3 of the units that were at sea, at least tentatively, the Japanese air forces in the Philippines were getting ready for their big effort. According to the show plan, the land-based air forces would exert maximum effort beginning on the morning of October 24, and the 2nd Air Fleet had been ferried down from Formosa for that purpose, a group of 196 planes of all kinds. The Japanese air commanders were well aware of the importance of their mission. The success or failure of this attack was to have a tremendous effect upon the breakthrough of the naval surface units into Leyte Bay. The Japanese were not in a position for several days to conduct the most effective air searches, pinned down as they were by the planes from the 3rd Fleet and the escort carriers, and holding their air strength until the last. Thus, between October 20 and 23, the Japanese were unaware of the whereabouts of Admiral Halsey and his fleet. But at night on the 23rd, it was imperative that they know, so the Japanese commander, Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, ordered night search by flying boats and 2 waves of dawn scouts. The pilots were told to be ready to man their planes at dawn. Just after midnight, the Japanese sighted a large force of ships at 90 degrees, some 250 miles off Manila, and Fukudome decided to launch a pre-dawn attack. The weather was vile, unfortunately, but there was nothing else to be done, and it was imperative, the Emperor's wish in fact, that the Americans be destroyed. The planes took off in 2 waves and attacked, but the weather stopped them, and only 1 bomber even caught sight of a ship before they were forced to turn around and go home. At 6:30 a.m. the attacks were resumed, and this time the Japanese found 3 groups of Task Force 38 lined up along the eastern shore of the Philippines, 150 to 200 miles from shore. They moved in to attack, and the aerial battle began. Here is the way the Japanese saw the battle. At 8:53 a.m. a group of surface craft with 4 regular aircraft carriers and 2 light aircraft carriers, as its nucleus was discovered at 80 degrees and 160 miles off Manila. At 9 a.m. another group with 2 carriers was found 50 to 60 miles north of the first group, and at 9:40 a.m. the third group with 3 aircraft carriers was spotted east of the San Bernardino Strait. The first and second waves of attack planes converged upon the first group of surface craft, and made a direct hit with 250-kilogram bombs on a large regular carrier. They set fire to 1 battleship, set fire and inflicted considerable damage to a cruiser, and shot down at least 32 enemy planes. Our losses were 67 planes missing. The third 3 carrier bombers took off in the afternoon, but returned owing to bad weather. Following this, 24 planes in 3 groups took to the air in search of the enemy's third group with carriers. What had actually happened was that the Japanese during the day did damage the destroyer Leyte, the oiler Ashtabula and landing ship tank 552, and caused the sinking of the light carrier Princeton. Thus, the Japanese claims were not so ridiculous, giving them credit for mistaking a destroyer for a battleship. In fact, they did more damage than they claimed. The story of the Princeton and the Japanese attack is a sad but poignant one. It shows the bravery of the enemy, his luck for a moment, and the bad luck of the American forces. The morning had begun with dawn search teams launched by the American carriers. They headed aloft and then spread out to cover the west side of the island of Luzon, the Sibuyan Sea, which lies in the middle of the Philippines, and the Sulu Sea, which lies between Borneo and the Philippines. All 3 task groups had been pulled back toward the Philippine coast. Now Admiral Sherman was to the north with the Princeton and his other carriers, just off Luzon. Meanwhile, Admiral Bogan was near San Bernardino Strait, and Admiral Davison's force was south of that, off Leyte Gulf. All carriers began flying searches that morning, and just after 8 a.m. a plane from Bogan's Intrepid found Admiral Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. 10 minutes later, Admiral Halsey had the information. The alert was on, in flag plot the words became crisp, and the thought was about the strikes to be made at the enemy force. It would all be done by air. It must be remembered that the seas around the Philippines had been Japanese waters since 1942 and were presumed to be mined effectively, and the Americans had discovered in the invasion of Leyte that this was true. Thus, although it would seem a simple matter for the battleships and cruisers to move into San Bernardino Strait and trap the oncoming Japanese, Admiral Nimitz had issued strict orders that no ships were to go into the strait without his expressed permission. While the Americans were preparing to launch their strikes against the enemy, the Japanese were coming in on Sherman's force. This also happened to be the force in which Admiral Mitscher was riding in the Lexington, his flagship. During the night of October 23 to 24, those Japanese flying boats had effectively spotted the task group and were almost constantly over it, tracking. Night fighters were put up and kept the Japanese at a distance, but they had no intention of attacking. Their mission was to observe. A night fighter shot down one snooper at 2:27 a.m., but they kept on buzzing around, and just before 6 a.m., the radar screens showed 5 separate observation planes at different points on the screens. "The enemy," said Admiral Sherman, "was evidently well aware of our position, at least of our task group, if not of the others. He was aware of the others, and yet Sherman's force was to bear the brunt of the big airstrike called under the show operation. At dawn, Sherman's carriers launched their searches. The planes, fighters, and dive bombers were armed with bombs, and in addition, the decks of the carriers were now crowded with torpedo bombers, waiting for news of the enemy so they might strike. On the Princeton, operations began at 5:20 a.m. with a call to general quarters, and plans were made for a long, dangerous, and tiring day. Breakfast was prepared and served at battle stations. The sun rose that morning at 6:46 a.m. Already the Essex and the Lexington had launched their searches, which were to fan out 300 miles and report. The Langley was responsible for anti-snooper patrol and anti-submarine patrol, and she launched those forces, plus a 4-plane combat air patrol that would circle over the task group. The Essex also launched a 20-plane fighter sweep that was sent against Japanese airfields around Manila. The Princeton's responsibility, which she fulfilled, was to launch a force of 8 fighters for the combat air patrol. The Japanese spotter planes were swarming around the carrier force by this time. By 7:50 a.m., the combat air patrol planes from the Langley had shot down 2 Japanese snoopers, and the Princeton's planes shot down 2 more. At about 7:50 a.m., the search radar picked up a large force of Japanese planes stacked in the air from 25,000 feet on down. The Japanese were about 75 miles west of the task group. First came the report of one enemy group, and then a report of a second. It was an exciting moment because the Japanese planes were discovered just after a contact report from search planes, which indicated the presence of Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. Admiral Sherman was ready to send his torpedo planes against these forces, so they were on deck. Then he had to put up more fighters to join the combat air patrol from the carriers. That was the next order of business. The planes in the air were directed toward the enemy, and then the Langley and the Princeton each launched a dozen more fighters, and the Essex launched 7. It was not enough. A few minutes later, even more Japanese planes were spotted coming in from the west, 60 miles away. At 8:31 a.m., the Lexington launched her remaining dozen fighter planes. The Japanese, by coming in such strength, had already accomplished one thing. They delayed the Sherman force. What was now at stake was the life of the group, and Sherman prepared for radical sea maneuvers. Fortunately, the weather was very spotty, and he could run in and out of a number of rain squalls in the vicinity. It was in the squall to escape the Japanese, out to launch and recover, and back in again. "We were kept pretty busy with the attack for the next several hours," said Admiral Sherman. "The first planes headed toward the enemy, and soon the radar screens on the ships became confused. The largest raid of all was the third reported, and Commander David McCampbell, the Essex Air Group commander, took on this one. McCampbell had been spotted in his fighter plane on the catapult, fueling for the strike against the Sibuyan Sea force of Admiral Kurita. He was to lead the fighters. But with the coming in of this third force of enemy planes, Admiral Sherman's orders changed all that. McCampbell said, "We got word of this raid coming in, had already closed to about 45 miles, and so I was launched in a scramble." In other words, we scrambled all the fighters who were available at that particular time. We got 7 off. Even though his plane was not completely full of gas, McCampbell took off and headed toward the enemy. We intercepted them about 30 miles from our own ships. They had altitude on us at the time. About the time we sighted them, they started to turn to the left, apparently searching or having overshot the position they thought we were in. We never figured out why they turned to the left anyway. When we hit them as they were making their left turn, they continued on. The bombers dove on through the overcast. Our second combat team was to hit the stragglers or the bombers, and I told them that I would take my combat team up and start from the top and work down. Due to a mix-up in the communications there, we had to shift channels after we got off, for 5 of them went down on the bombers, and that left only my wingman and me up topside. When the bombers went through the overcast, the 5 went after them. I think they got 12 or 13 planes out of that. The Japanese fighters went into a Loughborough circle. There were about 40 of them, and it's a pretty difficult sort of thing. We didn't even attempt to make a run while they were in this big Loughborough circle, but we had altitude on them, and we just circled over them and watched them and waited for them to make a move. McCampbell's wingman was Lieutenant Roy Rushing. McCampbell called him on the radio and told him I thought that they must be running out of gas pretty soon, and I knew that we had plenty of gas, so they'd have to head somewhere, and that's when we would work them over. And they circled for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and headed for Manila. These were the fighters only. The bombers had all scattered and had been pretty well taken care of, so Rushing and I followed them back to Manila. We were engaged with them for about an hour and 35 minutes. We finally, after much screaming for help, got one other man to help us out there for a little while, and he ran out of ammunition and turned off and went to the ship. They only got one. He was one of the 5 that had gone down with the bombers. The ship didn't support us because they had another big raid coming in at the same time, and they had launched the rest of their fighters to support the second raid. So Roy and I just took it easy, and we'd wait until some joker climbed a little too high or dragged a little too far behind. They were scissoring very nicely. They kept good formation, and their weave, their tactics, were very similar to our own, and perhaps had we not been familiar with those tactics, it wouldn't have been so easy for us. We just bided our time there, and I don't think any of them ever got a shot at us. He and I together knocked down 15 of them, and we burned 15 and claimed a couple of more probables in there because you'd see them smoke and they'd pull off and go down. Well, you didn't have to watch them to see where the hell they were going. But anyway, we followed them all the way in, back into Manila, and when they dove down through the clouds, apparently to go to their fields, we were very low on gas and out of ammunition, and we thought it was time to go home. I got back to our own ship. They had the deck spotted for takeoff and couldn't take me aboard, so I had to land on one of the other carriers. I had 6 gallons of gas and 2 rounds of ammunition when I got back. Roy had a little more. While the fighters were doing their job, the task group was manoeuvring in and out of those rain squalls, making a very elusive target for the Japanese, so elusive that no successful attacks were carried out. By 8:45 a.m., the second enemy air attack had been broken up, and Admiral Sherman ordered the carriers to get ready to make their strikes against the Japanese ships as quickly as they could. The Japanese were scattered. All that showed on the radar scopes was an occasional loner, and only one within 25 miles of the formation. At about 9 a.m., the carriers were busy recovering fighters who were as low on fuel and ammunition, or almost so, as McCampbell had been. He landed on the Langley, others landed elsewhere. The Princeton and the other carriers moved to a course of 065 degrees into the wind at 24 knots to begin flight operations. 6 of the Princeton's loaded torpedo bombers were moved to the hangar deck and spotted in a fore and aft line on the port side. The Princeton recovered 10 fighters and was getting ready to recover 2 more. The gasoline detail was fueling the planes. Everything was moving splendidly. At 9:12 a.m., the Essex had reported a possible bogey about 6 miles to the northwest, but that was all. Otherwise, life was very quiet, or as quiet as it could be on a carrier that was landing shot-up planes, some of them bearing wounded men. At 9:35 a.m., a single Japanese plane was spotted through the hazy clouds. She was diving, coming in on a shallow plane on the Princeton. The 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns of the Princeton and the ships around her began to open up. At 9:38 a.m., the mobile came on the talk-between-ships circuit. "Dive bomber 160 in a dive," shouted her radio man. But the Princeton did not even hear the transmission because the noise from the anti-aircraft was so intense. The forward batteries were firing as rapidly as they could get off the shots. On the bridge, Captain W.H. Baraka ordered the quartermaster to steer 20 degrees left in order to miss the bomber. The plane kept boring in and dropped one 250-kilogram bomb about 75 feet forward of the after elevator on the port side of the ship. The plane passed over and was caught by American fighters, which shot it down in short order after it had passed through the fleet at about 1,000 feet and leveled off. When the bomb hit, Captain Baraka was not particularly worried. It was a small bomb. He thought his damage control men would be able to slip a patch over the hole in the deck and get back to flight operations in a few minutes. But he was not reckoning with that bomb and the 6 loaded torpedo planes on the hangar deck immediately below. The bomb passed directly through one of those torpedo planes and exploded between the hangar and the second deck. Flames shot down through engineering space aft and then back into the hangar and spread. Immediately after the bomb hit, thick black smoke was seen to be issuing from around the edges of the forward elevator, from the hole in the flight deck, and from every access to the hangar deck aft of the island structure. Word was passed on the general announcing circuit, "Fire in the hangar deck, fire in the hangar deck." The captain immediately called radar plot on the captain's command circuit to reach the executive officer, but that officer had already left his battle station to proceed to the scene of the fire. Below decks, the bomb hit had not been considered very serious either. It was felt as a dull jar, and the first lieutenant did not receive any immediate report from any station on deck or from any repair party. The first lieutenant ordered the conflagration station to turn on the hangar sprinkling system. The order was acknowledged, but there was no positive report that it has been done. Almost immediately, the personnel in the station asked permission to abandon the station because of the heat. Was the sprinkling system on? For that was important. "Aye, sir," came the word to damage control. "We are abandoning." The bomb had struck very close to that conflagration station, where 3 men were stationed. The bomb hit so close that fragments were driven up through the deck at the station, and it filled with smoke and heat immediately. The talker at the phone was wounded severely but kept on. The other 2 men were driven out of the station and then could not get back in to rescue the 3rd man. A sailor in an asbestos suit came to help a few minutes later and tried to get in from the port gallery walkway, but the heat was so intense that the sweat inside his asbestos suit turned to steam. In a few moments, the whole deck was burning furiously. All 6 torpedo bombers were on fire, and all were loaded with torpedoes and full tanks of gasoline. Aft, a man managed to reach the panel control box and pushed the buttons for the sprinkling system. There was no result. A water hose was brought out, but the pressure failed. Lieutenant Auclair, hangar deck officer, went to the fire station on the port side and turned on the pressure for 2 hoses. He ran to turn on the hangar sprinkling amidships, but found the control switches smoking and telephone talkers there overcome by smoke. He found the executive officer and reported by that time the first talker was dead and the conflagration station had blown up. On the bridge, Captain Baraka reported to Admiral Sherman that he had taken a bomb and would keep him informed. The ship was making 24 knots. Sherman asked if the Princeton wanted to slow down. The captain asked the chief engineer, and that officer said it was not necessary. The engineering plant was all right, except it was getting pretty smoky down there. One of the problems from the beginning was the impairment of the fire main pressure, caused when the electrical systems in the hangar sprinklers shorted out. Commander J.N. Murphy, the executive officer, not found it virtually impossible to get into the hangar, and he conferred with Lieutenant Auclair. The executive officer tried to get the sprinklers operated manually from the 3rd deck, but there still was no pressure. The gas tanks on the planes began exploding, and so did the ammunition in the guns and gun belts, and that stored in the hangar. Because of the communications failures, some time elapsed before the captain knew that the water pressure aft had failed. Then he slowed to 18 knots. He was prepared to stop if necessary. His job now was to get the men out of the spaces below, before they were overcome by heat and smoke. The repair officers, Lieutenant Carson and Ensign Christie, kept working to open valves that would divert water into the sprinkling system and hoses going to the log room. They went to the barber shop to find the valves. In the main engine control room, a flash followed the dull jar of the bomb, went into the after-engine room through the vent ducts and burned the chief of the watch. Heavy black smoke filled that room, and almost immediately it was cut off from communication with the rest of the ship. Within 1 minute after the bomb hit, the forward engine room was filling with smoke to the point of suffocation and darkness. All hands were ordered to put on their gas masks, even as explosions could be heard from the planes in the hangar. On deck, the gunnery stations aft to ear reported that the heat to port was growing so intense that they must evacuate. Soon the starboard stations reported the same. The gunnery officer had them stay a while and ordered the gunners' mates to watch the ready service magazines and sprinkle them if the temperature hit 100 degrees. Aft on the flight deck, the heat was becoming so intense that Lieutenant Commander Curtis, the assistant air officer, took shelter under the platform. He and his men tried to work their way forward but could not, and eventually they retreated to the fantail. At 9:41 a.m. came a message from Admiral Sherman. "How many planes do you have in the air?" 10 was the answer, so Sherman began asking the other ships in the task group. The Lexington could take 6 planes, the F6F. They were sent to the other carriers, and that problem was resolved. There were many incidents of heroism. A carpenter's mate went below into the smoke to try to start fire pumps, but he found the power out in that region of the ship. The chief engineer asked the captain if there was any chance of controlling the fire. Baraka said he thought so. The chief engineer said things were getting pretty bad below, but they would keep operating. Worst of all, he said, they had lost all contact with the after fire room. The first lieutenant continued his work, and was so busy trying to find the extent of the damage that when the captain asked him for a report, he said he was too busy to give one. Captain Baraka had to be content with that for the moment. 10 minutes after the Japanese bomb struck the deck of the Princeton, men were going over the side to escape the intense heat that was building aft. Lieutenant Commander Curtis, who was aft, called the air officer and suggested that if the ship could be turned out of the wind, it might help keep the heat from building up aft. Captain Baraka agreed and told Admiral Sherman that the Princeton was going to change course. This decision presented a whole new situation, which demanded many changes. The cruiser Reno and the destroyers Gatling, Irwin, and Cassin Young were designated to stay with the burning carrier, while the rest of the task group proceeded into the wind, operating aircraft. There was no other way. The Japanese had been found, and the war could not be delayed for the Princeton. The Princeton began to move on her new course, coming very close to the South Dakota, which moved to clear her, and as she moved, the engine room began to clear of smoke. This was reported to the bridge and gave the captain some satisfaction. It was the first little victory they had attained over the fire. The men below were in a bad position. At 9:55 a.m. they reported that the bilges were filling with hot water from the firefighting, and that this increased the heat so much in the engine room that men were beginning to pass out. The battle dressing stations in the sick bay below decks were filling with smoke, and the doctors and corpsmen had to abandon the area. In the wardroom, some 20 wounded were being treated, mostly for burns. At 9:56 steering control in the pilot house went out, and steering was immediately shifted to the after station, with the captain controlling from the bridge. There was no smoke in steering aft because the vent had been shut off as soon as it started to enter. By this time, men on the flight deck were pushing the planes overboard. Soon, 5 fighters slipped into the sea. The gas was drained out of the mains and dropped back into storage without any trouble. Gasoline on deck never did become a problem, but there were plenty of other problem snow. Captain Baraka watched from his bridge as they developed. It was 2 minutes past 10, to be exact, that the first major explosion occurred, and this was from the torpedoes which were mounted in the planes in the hangar. These explosions were severe. The first one was aft and blew out the after elevator. Shortly thereafter there was another one forward in the hangar, and about 5 minutes after 10 the forward elevator was knocked up. There was a hole put in the flight deck between the elevators, and practically the entire flight deck between the elevators was buckled upward. Before the forward elevator was knocked out, I could see from ship control station in the island structure the smoke and raging fire in the hangar, but the elevator, flush with the flight deck, kept the smoke from coming up in the bridge. When the forward elevator was knocked out, it released the smoke and fire to come up the island structure, and then I had to take steps to get the personnel out of the island. Those explosions always caused a number of flying fragments. There were some casualties on the bridge, and one man, a signalman, was so seriously injured that he died before we could get him off the ship. Captain Baraka told the people on the bridge to abandon. They moved down over the forward part of the bridge onto the crane, and then down onto the flight deck forward. They could not climb down the ladders and companionways because of the smoke and heat. He also ordered the chief engineer to secure below and get all personnel on deck, all hands topside, went the call over the general announcing system. The captain could only hope that every station would hear. Baraka met Commander Murphy, the executive officer, on the forward part of the flight deck and said it was time to execute salvage control Phase 1. This meant that most of the crew would abandon ship, and only those necessary to fight the fire would remain, plus a few to man the guns. As soon as he saw the explosions tearing the Princeton, Admiral Sherman detailed the cruiser Birmingham to join the standby party. The Princeton had moved about 5 miles astern of the task group by this time, and now the good reason for the heavy screen could be seen. A Japanese air raid began, and as the fighters scrambled, it became apparent that there was a problem. The Princeton had been responsible for the combat air patrol that morning. With her out of action, air patrol was diminished, and 2 Japanese fighters got through the air screen and began to approach the Princeton with what Admiral Kearney referred to as the airman's instinct for a cripple. The Reno's anti-aircraft guns began to pound, and they shot down the Japanese planes that were moving in. Captain Thomas B. Inglis was in command of the Birmingham, and as senior officer present, he was in command now of the ships that were trying to help the Princeton. When I found myself senior officer present of this group, I instructed the destroyers to concentrate on recovering the Princeton's personnel. The Princeton had abandoned ship except for the captain and perhaps 40 or 50 men. There were at the time we were approaching Princeton something over 1,000 men in the water. I also instructed the Reno to circle this little group in order to provide anti-aircraft protection and anti-submarine protection to the limit of her ability. The Reno was an anti-aircraft cruiser, had an unusually good battery of anti-aircraft weapons, and also was equipped with submarine sound detection gear and depth charges, and was therefore quite effective. 2 of the destroyers were alongside the Princeton when the Birmingham arrived, and it was only with difficulty that the bigger ship managed to elbow them aside and come in, hoses laid out and ready. I got alongside the Princeton at about 11 a.m. and immediately thereafter began fighting the fire. I found that it was necessary to run a line to the Princeton in order to keep the 2 ships together, since the Princeton, with her high sides, made faster leeway than the Birmingham. My plan was to start fighting the fires from the forward end of the Princeton, and as they were extinguished, to work aft. After about half an hour they seemed to make headway, and Captain Inglis called for a party of volunteers. About 40 men boarded the carrier and began work there. They continued to work for 2.5 hours. By that time they had all the fires under control except one, but that was a bad one, very close to the carrier's after magazine. The destroyers moved about, picking up men. The Morrison picked up a number. The Irwin picked up some more, and also took on wounded. By the end of the day she had some 600 survivors from the Princeton and took them to Ulithi. The Morrison had come over with the Birmingham when Admiral Sherman had decided the Princeton needed more help. She moved alongside the Princeton on the lee side, a daring gesture compounded by misunderstanding of instructions from Captain Inglis, to deliver some artificers and engine room men that Captain Baraka asked for when things seemed to be coming under control. But then the Morrison became fouled in the overhanging sponsons of the carrier's starboard gun positions, when Commander W.H. Price, the ship's captain, had to move forward to escape the fire and smoke. He got hoses off his ship and onto the Princeton. Lieutenant Bradley, the assistant first lieutenant of the Princeton, came back aboard from the Morrison along with an enlisted man from the hull department. At about 1 p.m. the Morrison was ready to move, but she could not. She was stuck between the No. 2 and No. 3 stacks of the Princeton, and in the rolling her topside was taking a fearful mauling from the carrier's stacks and overhang. Something had to give way, and in her case it was the foremast, the stacks, her searchlight platform, her forward director, and the port side of her bridge. While the Morrison was alongside, the Princeton's navigator managed to go back aboard his ship and onto the bridge from the destroyer, and salvage a number of important papers, which he lowered by signal halyard to the men on the destroyer. The weather, which had been spotty, was definitely worsening as the afternoon came on. This increased the damage to the Morrison, and she tried to get the Irwin to pull her off, but the lines past to the Morrison parted, and after almost an hour the Morrison was still stuck fast to the carrier. It was at that time, said Captain Baraka, that we thought there would be no question, but that the fire would be put out in a matter of 20 to 30 minutes. We had received considerable damage by that time, but as far as we knew there was no damage below decks, and it was our thought that we would soon have the fire out. Then we would ventilate the spaces below, put the engineers down there, get up steam and bring the ship home. The ship was not very pretty, but at least we would bring her back. The captain was an optimist, no doubt about it, and the chief engineer had just been below, wearing rescue breathing apparatus. He found doors hot to the touch, and the smoke so thick a flashlight beam would not penetrate it. The third deck below was hot and full of smoke, and when the chief engineer entered the forward engine room he had to hold a battle lantern a foot from the panel to read the gauges. When he was back on deck, he advised the captain that it might be remotely possible to get the ship under way. At 1:30 p.m. the whole salvage project was endangered again by the coming of more Japanese planes. The Birmingham pulled away from the crippled carrier, Captain Inglis telling Captain Baraka he must move to fight the Japanese and avoid a cluster of ships that made a beautiful target for the enemy. The Birmingham recalled her fire control party and moved away with the destroyers and the Reno. Everyone, with the possible exception of the chief engineer of the Princeton, was optimistic about the chances for the carrier, and when the Morrison cleared away the debris and joined the screen, there was something to cheer about. What a beating she had taken! Even a tractor and a jeep from the carrier's flight deck had fallen down on her. The Japanese air raid flopped, partly because visibility had now gotten so bad at sea that it was possible to see only about 100 yards in all directions from the Princeton. The wind was rising and hit 20 knots. It was raining, and the seas were running heavily enough so that the men who had been fished out of the water could be glad they were not still there. The Princeton looked much better than one might expect. She was not listing, and she seemed to have about normal draft. Just after 2 p.m, a single Zero fighter swooped in, and the Reno opened up with those powerful batteries of 20mm and 40mm guns. The Zero turned and disappeared into the growing cloud cover. The Birmingham now made a report to Admiral Sherman. Fires on the Princeton now confined to after portion centred about bomb magazines. Prospects very good now. The Morrison has lost her foremast. The Irwin has one engine out of commission, result of debris in condenser. The Birmingham has superficial damage, including 2 5-inch mounts out of commission. The Reno smashed one 40mm mount while alongside. A carrier was not a safe ship for others to move about, obviously, with her big overhanging flight deck. But this damage seemed a small price to pay for what had been accomplished in getting the fires under control. Yet things were not all that they seemed that one Japanese snooper caused more trouble than he could ever have hoped to do. Captain Baraka was not critical of anyone. He quite understood why the Birmingham had not wanted to remain dead in the water alongside the carrier when Japanese planes were overhead. But the fire, which had been almost put out, started to build again as soon as we stopped fighting it when the ships cast off, he said. He had signalled at the end of the alert for one of the destroyers to come alongside. The Morrison came. The chief engineer of the Princeton said men could get below. Gunner Grant and Ensign Genie went down to try and open sprinklers that would play on the forward magazines. They opened the valves, but nothing happened. A conference among the officers on the Princeton indicated that with the fire now so well under control, it might be feasible to take the ship under tow. The air attack had not developed further, and accordingly, as the Birmingham came by on the port side, a semaphore message was sent to her. "Can you take me in tow?" "Affirmative," came the answer, and the Birmingham prepared to tow, but now it was seen on the Princeton that the fires were gaining headway, and that the Morrison simply did not have the hose power to put the fire out. So Captain Baraka asked that the Reno replace the Morrison and fight the fires again, but the Reno would take a beating if she came alongside, and the Reno could not take either, because she had lost her towing reel on October 14, when a Japanese plane crashed into her fantail. It was decided that the Birmingham would come back, fight the fires to extinction, and then take the Princeton in tow. All this took time, and the seas were rising and the wind whistling now, The Birmingham began approaching the injured carrier at around 2:45 p.m., with her bow at an angle to the windward port amidships of the Princeton. It was a very difficult approach, and the Princeton would drift away, so that the Birmingham had to drop off and try again. Consequently, the fires burned, and it was not until 3:15 p.m. that the Birmingham came close enough to the Princeton for a line to be successfully thrown over to the flight deck of the carrier. "In the meantime," said Captain Baraka, "I had sent our air officer, Commander Bruce L. Harwood, with several other officers and men, a total of about 25, aft to the hangar to be there to take the lines and hoses from the Birmingham as soon as she could get alongside. I might say that Commander Harwood had been particularly conspicuous all day by his outstanding leadership in directing fire parties and in his constant disregard of personal danger. There had been no serious explosions on the Princeton since 10:20 a.m. that morning, and now it was almost 3:30 p.m. I had always been concerned about a compartment just aft of the hangar on the starboard side of the ship, which was our ready torpedo stowage and in which we had spare torpedo air flasks, and also an overload of bombs which could not be accommodated in the main magazines below decks. I felt concern about this space not only for our own personnel, but also for the ships alongside. There had been fires raging around that space and in that immediate vicinity practically ever since the bomb hit at 9:38 a.m. in the morning. The place was impossible to get into to attempt to jettison any of these explosive. Also, we had none of our own firefighting pressure aft from practically the time the bomb hit had been led to believe that trinitrotoluene operates in strange ways at times. So I had hoped and thought it quite possible that the explosions that would come from that space had already done so or would not occur. There could have been some low-order detonations which couldn't be told from other explosions we had suffered. However, at 3:23 p.m., while the Birmingham was still in the process of tying up on our port side aft, there was the most terrific explosion of the day in this space. The explosion was as surprising as it was terrifying. I think it can be well compared to a small volcano. A considerable portion of the afterpart of the ship above decks was knocked into the air and fell in the water astern. Flying fragments, some huge, some small, burst outward and upward, showering the deck of the Princeton from stem to stern. Practically all of those of us remaining aboard the Princeton were injured. Those of us who were not killed, Commander Harwood and his party aft in the hangar were all lost. Captain Hoskins, the prospective commanding officer of the Princeton, who had just recently come aboard so there had not been time to transfer command, had been standing with me amidships on the port side where we were to receive the lines from the bow of the Birmingham. When those of us in that immediate vicinity first hit the deck and then started to run forward to get behind some planes for protection, someone noticed that Captain Hoskins couldn't move. I turned around and saw his right foot was hanging by a shred. I called for Commander Sala, our senior medical officer, who had been with us just before this explosion, but by some means unknown to him he found himself on the forecastle forward. He was injured. I did not realize this, but he proceeded to render first aid treatment to Captain Hoskins. Captain Hoskins had fortunately fallen near a piece of line, which he, with great presence of mind, used to apply a tourniquet to his leg. The doctor made his way to him with some sulphur powder and morphine, using a sheath knife to cut off the part of the leg that was dangling. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Sala himself was given treatment for his wounds. Even with this explosion, the Princeton was still not listing or going down. All the damage was above the waterline. The captain wanted a tow and asked the Birmingham for it, but the Birmingham said she had been hurt by the blast and could not tow. The Reno could not tow. The destroyers were too small to tow, so the word went out to Admiral Sherman that the Princeton wanted a tow. Captain Baraka knew that it would be some time before a towing vessel could detach itself from the task group, make its way to the Princeton, and get to work. So he decided to take everyone off the ship, temporarily at least, then bring them back when the towing vessel arrived. In a short time, we were able to get alongside some small boats from the destroyers on either side of our bow, forward. Then we proceeded to lower Captain Hoskins by means of a stretcher, then the wounded, and finally the remaining personnel. Before this was done, several inspections had been made below decks and throughout the accessible parts of the ship to assure ourselves that there were no living personnel remaining. At 4 p.m. I left the Princeton, the last to leave. Captain Baraka went to the Birmingham to receive a shock. Here is the story of Commander Winston Folk, Executive Officer of the Birmingham. At the time of the explosion on Princeton, I was on the starboard side of the signal bridge, a few feet from the captain. We were both struck by debris and knocked to the deck. As soon as I had sufficiently recovered, I went to the captain to see how he was. He had gotten to his feet and said he had been hit, but felt that he was all right. At that time, he directed me to ascertain the results of the explosion. I set out to do so, completely unprepared for the spectacle that was to greet me. What had happened was that 229 officers and men killed instantly, and 420 were wounded, 219 of these seriously, and 4 men were missing. The executive himself was suffering from deafness and shock and shrapnel wounds, and the captain? When I returned to the bridge to make my report to the captain, I was due for another blow. I found that his first feeling of being all right had been the result of numbness from shock, that actually, because of his many injuries, particularly the bad break of his left arm, he had been forced to turn the command over to the gunnery officer and to put the commander of the Reno in command of the unit. The executive officer wanted to help the captain, but Captain Inglis refused. Never mind me, there are many in worse condition, and gave the command to the executive officer. The way the men turned to help their fellows was remarkable. The Birmingham had only one medical officer aboard, because the senior doctor had been sent to Santa Fe to perform emergency surgery earlier. The dentist and one chief pharmacist's mate were killed in the explosion, and the junior medical officer had 14 hospital corpsmen to help him. They directed the ship's company to give first aid, and the doctor found those with perforated abdominal wounds as quickly as possible and began operating. 2 groups were formed to splint fractures. When such measures had been taken, the third step consisted of putting patients in sick bay and the wardroom. By evening, a medical officer came from the Reno and the senior medical officer came back aboard. All this while, the Birmingham continued to be a ship of war, and much was demanded of her. Said Commander Folk, "Shortly after I assumed command, I was informed that the Princeton still wanted to be towed. That seemed almost too much. With over 400 of the ship's company dead or badly wounded, with all the remainder, including some 200 slightly to moderately wounded, who were not actually required on watch working their hearts out with the badly wounded. We were still faced with the prospect of having to continue to rig for towing, yet when I consulted the acting first lieutenant and the boatswain, the latter painfully wounded himself, their answer was, "Yes, if we have to tow, we can tow." Captain Baraka of the Princeton went to the Birmingham and only then learned of the casualties and that Captain Inglis was hurt. He moved over to the Reno, where Captain R.C. Alexander had taken charge of the force. When I arrived at the Reno, Captain Alexander informed me that my request for a tow had been sent to the task group and force commanders, but just as I got aboard, the word came back for the Princeton to be destroyed and for the remaining ships to rejoin the task group. The decision to destroy the Princeton was prompted by the damage which she had already suffered, by the damage suffered by the assisting ships, by the fact that the fire was still not out with night coming on, and by the fact that we were only 125 miles from Manila. The Japanese had already showed that they had more airplanes up their sleeves than the Americans had previously suspected. Besides this, there was a healthy fear of the Japanese carriers, and during the activities of the day, while the Princeton had been fighting for her life, the Ozawa force, including carriers, had been located in the north. Further, it was suspected that the planes that were attacking the task group and the plane that had dropped the little 250-kilogram bomb on the Princeton were from those carriers. Nobody in the heat of battle knew all the answers, but the suspicions were enough. A burning carrier at night with the fleet was simply a beacon for the Japanese, who had shown their adeptness at night-hawking before. The destroyer Irwin was supposed to smash the poor Princeton with torpedoes, but the Irwin had taken such a beating from the Princeton in coming alongside that the torpedo gear was smashed. She fired 6 torpedoes with almost disastrous results to herself. 2 of them came boomeranging back and very nearly blasted the Irwin out of the water. The first torpedo hit the Princeton in the bow, doing minor damage, and the rest missed, so the Reno took over the job. At 5:50 p.m., the Reno launched 2 torpedoes from a range of about 2,800 yards, and I think the first one was all that was required, said Captain Baraka. The torpedo seemed to hit in the Princeton's forward large 80,000-gallon gasoline tank, or probably in the after edge of the tank, which is just forward of our forward magazines. There was a terrific explosion, flames shot high in the air, and the ship was under water in less than a minute. That was the end of the gallant Princeton, whose captain had tried so hard to save her. And there was first blood for the Japanese air forces, to avenge the events off Palawan the morning before. It was planes, not ships, that had done this job. Battle of the Sibuyan Sea early on the morning of October 24, the planes of the American task groups, acting on instructions from Admiral Halsey, were out scouting for the Japanese fleet. They knew it was divided into several forces. First contact with the Japanese was made by a plane from the Intrepid just after 8 a.m. In a few minutes Admiral Bogan had the news, and so did Admiral Halsey. Then the Cabot's planes were on the target in the Sibuyan Sea, complementing and extending the information. Over the American Channel Sea came this message from an Intrepid plane. The force consists of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 13 destroyers. Location is south of southern tip of Mindoro. Course 050, speed 10-12 knots. No transports in the group, and in all a total of 25 warships. Immediately the messages began to go out from Halsey's 3rd Fleet flag plot on the New Jersey. First were messages to Admirals Bogan, Sherman and Davison to be sure that they had the information. Sherman and Davison were asked specifically to break radio silence to report any information about the enemy. Then Sherman and Davison were asked to concentrate on Bogan's task group, which would pull the carriers together. And then Halsey ordered Admirals Mitcher and Sherman to strike the enemy. Bogan's task group was the first to be ready to strike, and he so reported, and Halsey told him to go ahead and wished him good luck. This way was not the way that Admiral Raymond Spruance would have handled the airstriker. Spruance, as commander of the fleet, would have entrusted to Admiral Mitcher, the leader of Task Force 38, the carrier groups, the right and responsibility to give the orders for strikes and all other action. But Spruance was not a carrier admiral, and Halsey was. How could Halsey forget the days early in the war when he had the scrappiest task force afloat? It was patently impossible. Halsey was just not built that way. It was not that Halsey would never listen to reason. He was always listening, right up to the point where he would wag his finger, which meant the debate was cut off. But in times when action was needed, Halsey was ready to take active command of a situation. Naval historians, principally Samuel Eliot Morrison, have noted that Halsey sent orders directly to the task group commanders, bypassing Admiral Mitcher, who throughout 24 October was little more than a passenger in his own task force. Halsey said he did not bypass Mitcher any more than was his way. I always assigned targets to hit, leaving details to group and task force commanders. I would certainly have been derelict in my duty as fleet commander if I did not assign targets for them to strike, and would have been a fifth wheel if I exercised no control or command over the elements of my fleet. I always did this, and in doing it never felt that I was bypassing any junior echelon in the command. I always felt free to assume tactical command, if I thought the conditions warranted it. This was, of course, a difference in attitude toward his command, a very great difference from Spruance, and one that was to cause future historians to compare Halsey as a strategist most unfavourably with Spruance. Admiral Nimitz used to say that when he sent Spruance out with the fleet, he was always sure he would bring it home. When he sent Halsey out, he did not know precisely what was going to happen. By the time of the Philippines operation, Nimitz had made up his mind that he would use Halsey largely to roam the seas in the manner of a buccaneer of old, certain that Halsey would find action if there was any to find, and that Halsey would never shrink from an encounter with the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, the forthcoming landing operations out of the Central Pacific Command, the major ones, would all be planned so that Spruance, the careful, thoughtful, intellectual admiral, would have control of the fleet during those operations. After the war, comparisons were made by Navy men of the two admirals under Nimitz. Some said that if Halsey had been at the Marianas in June, he would have sent the carriers out to get the Japanese fleet by day, and would have sent the fast battleships out for a night engagement, that he would have polished off the Japanese fleet right there. Or had Spruance been in charge at this operation in Leyte Gulf, he would have behaved entirely differently. Spruance confirmed that too, even as the battle was going on, and he was waiting and listening at Pearl Harbor. But at 8 a.m. on October 24, Admiral William F. Halsey was scarcely worrying about what historians of the future would say about him. His next move was to call back Admiral McCain, ordering him to reverse his course from that leading to Ulithi, and then, on the dawning of October 25, to launch a search north and northwest. This order shows that Halsey was sorting out the picture he had. Here is Admiral Kearney's recollection of what was going on in the flag plot on the New Jersey. The reinforced searches were launched in the morning, and in view of the fact that we guarded the aircraft search frequencies direct, we picked up their ports as made, and by the forenoon of October 24, had amazingly fine information as to the composition, course and speed of two enemy groups of surface ships moving to the eastward. One, though the Sulu Sea, Nishimura, obviously headed for Surigao, and one heading in the direction of the Sibuyan Sea, coming around Mindoro. At this point, it is interesting to note that as far as the Third Fleet was concerned, there could be little or no alibi based on lack of information or incorrect information. I don't believe that in the history of any major action at sea has the intelligence information from searches been so good, so thorough, so quickly put through, and so complete. In flag plot, when the two above-mentioned forces were spotted, it was believed that there must be a missing piece to the puzzle. That was the reason for the order to Admiral Mitcher, find that missing piece. Halsey and his staff were well aware of the shuttling that had been tried at the first Battle of the Philippine Sea. They called it beautiful. The carrier planes could make a one-way trip to an airfield via the target, which would be the American force, and by so doing their carriers could be employed from a much farther distance than could the American carriers. The Zeros, for example, and some of the other Japanese planes were lighter than the American planes. They were not armoured properly, if at all, and this gave them greater range. Combine that with shuttling, and one could see how it was possible for the Japanese to launch and carry out avital strike against the American carriers, while the Americans could not possibly reach them. The old adage of carrier warfare was to hit the enemy first and knock out those carriers. In the Philippines, theoretically at least, the Japanese technique of shuttling represented a terrible anger to the American fleet, and Admiral Ozawa was counting on his greater range to make optimum use of his lesser force. "If they could employ this very clever tactic, they had us on the hip," said Admiral Kearney. We had recognized that from their efforts in the first Battle of the Philippine Sea, and had decided that, should this occasion arise, we would make a high-speed run-in on them, preferably at night, and prevent them from getting away with any such scheme. So the messages went out that morning. Soon Admiral Mitcher, who was riding in the Lexington not far from the poor Princeton, reported that many enemy planes were around them in Task Group 38.3, Sherman's force. Halsey knew then that there was going to be some tough opposition, for Mitcher was never one to overstate the case. Yet Halsey continued, in spite of all preoccupations, to be concerned with that enemy task force of carriers, and that morning sent Mitcher the following: Top secret urgent from Com 3rd Fleet to Commander Task Force. 38 information. Commander Task Group, 38.2 enemy carrier strength not located. Keep area to north under observation. Then the war heated up. Admiral Nishimura, with the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, the cruiser Mogami, and the destroyers Michishio, Yamagumo, Asagumo, and Shigura, was steaming in the Sulu Sea, heading for Surigao Strait, when he was spotted just after 9 a.m. on October 24, some 75 miles east of the Cagayan Islands. The planes from the carrier Franklin underestimated the force they saw. No major units were sighted. Just off Puccio Point, Panay, 2 old-type destroyers and a larger vessel, possibly a Katori light cruiser, were sighted. 2 of the attack search groups joined to attack. The ships were strafed, hit with rockets, and bombed. The larger vessel was sunk, and later 8 fighters and 11 bombers added further to the damage of the remaining ships. However, these were not seen to sink. The fact was that the damage was confined to one minor hit on the fantail of the battleship Fuso, the knockout of a gun crew on the destroyer Shigura, and the shooting down of the Nishimura float planes, which left the Fuso blind thereafter. This mistake was not uncommon in the battle of the next few hours. The underestimation by the Japanese and the overestimation by the Americans of damage done the enemy. Admiral Shima's force was sighted by a land-based bomber of the 5th Army Air Force near the Cagayan Islands that morning. Confidential. Urgent 7615 from 5th Bomber Command to all interested Ops. This is my second report this force. 2 Fuso-class battleships, 1 unidentified heavy cruiser, 4 unidentified, garble, latitude 121 to 35, course 60 true, speed 15 knots. I am returning to base. One of the troubles with these reports was the garbling of the classification of the last group of ships, destroyers, and another was the misidentification of the ships. Actually, they were 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers in the Shima force. But in this case it turned out to make virtually no difference because of command decisions that were made by Admiral Halsey in the hours to come. The Third Fleet's air arm would concentrate on its attacks against the major force of Admiral Kurita during the day. The first strike of fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers was launched from the carriers Intrepid and Cabot just after 9 a.m. in response to Admiral Halsey's orders. Here is the way the strike from the Cabot went. These planes took off at 9:15 a.m. and made a running rendezvous with the strike commander and his planes from the USS Intrepid. The torpedo bombers climbed to 12,000 feet and flew in a loose V formation just below the SB-2Cs, dive bombers. One division of Fighting 29 Hellcats fighters were at 14,000 feet flying medium cover, and the other was flying high cover at 16,000 feet. At 10:25 a.m., the Jap fleet was sighted in Tablas Strait east of Mindoro Island. At that time, the attack formation was 25 miles northeast of this position. The fleet appeared to consist of about 25 ships and was on a heading of 045 degrees true, making an estimated 18 knots. There was a destroyer screen of about 12 ships surrounding the group, inside of which there were 2 columns of 4 cruisers each. In a single column in the center of the whole group, there were 3 or 4 battleships. At least 2 of these were of the Yamato class. That was good identification. 1 was the Yamato and 1 was of the Congo class. When the attack formation was 12 miles away, on a course of 265 degrees true, the fleet was at 2 p.m. off the starboard bow. Instructions for the attack were then received from the strike commander. Planes were directed to positions on all sides of the fleet disposition.